10 seconds for you. Right, we are live, folks. So thank you to everyone who's going to be joining us tonight. And get your questions coming for Ward, who was a former F-14 A and B RIO and now author and absolutely amazing YouTuber. But Ward, what's been happening since the last time we chatted?
Well, Mike, just kind of more of the same. We've done a number of episodes since you and I talked. A few live streams. As subscribers know, we talked to generally Justin Bronk about the war in Ukraine, particularly with a focus on the air war. He's located in London at RUSI. He's been a fantastic resource for us. He was the winner of the first ever Moochie for last year. My awards that I give for both Guest of the Year and Guest with the most views. So Justin was Guest of the Year. So he's been on talking about a number of things, including which airplane would be best for Ukraine. And he's got some really sophisticated points of view on that. And then the most recent one was talking about, is NATO, particularly is Europe, not the EU, but is Europe ready for an air war with Russia? And the answer is maybe surprising to some people. So he was on. I've had Paco Benitez, who is the guy who puts together the Merge newsletter on, again, in one of our Deep Intel series. This one was about next generation air dominance, or a sixth generation fighter. And Paco is a real hybrid talent. He was an F-15 Strike Eagle weapons systems officer, a guy in the backseat.
Nice.
And he also was in the programmatic world when he was in the Air Force in a whole bunch of ways. So he uses that experience to populate that newsletter, the Merge, with really specific and exclusive stuff. But he's also a great guy to have on the channel. So we did a live stream with him recently. And then yesterday, we posted a episode that is using DCS, which is Digital Combat Simulator. I'm actually sitting in my DCS cockpit right here talking to you.
Nice.
Which is a different point of view than behind me is where I normally shoot my episodes with the guitars and stuff in the background. So people may recognize the Marshall amp and the guitars over there. But I thought I'd, mix it up here and talk to you from my super comfortable sim pit. But Nasty Manazer, who's been on the channel, I think this was his fourth episode, jumped into the simulator to fly the F-14B and demonstrate what we call BFM, basic fighter maneuvering techniques. And he put on his F-14 training squadron hat, as he's done before on the channel. This is the first time he flew VR, because I have VR now. I was using Track IR before, and now I'm using VR. And he just had a blast and really imparted some great lessons. So if people haven't checked out that episode, they seriously should. So that's what's been happening. I'm working on an episode about drones being used as aggressors. That's a new thing that's happening. It's called the Bandit program. The drones are called the Fury drones. And so I'm sort of thinking about the practical implications about adding drones to the mix in terms of how do you brief a flight? Who's flying these drones? Sort of the practical, where are the drone pilots flying from? Those kind of questions. Because that's, being a practitioner, a guy who did it, I hear the technology and I think it's a cool idea. It will improve air-to-air training in this new threat, return to the peer conflict environment. But there's some basic questions I have as this idea gets funded. And the company has been funded to create 4 of these drone aggressors. So that episode will be going live later this week.
Awesome stuff. As you can see there on the right ward, there's some questions coming in, so I'm gonna let you loose. Sorry, and yeah, folks, get your questions coming in for Mooch, who is a former F-14 AMB RIO and yeah, author and YouTuber. So Mooch, enjoy.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So let's take them in order that we have so far, and please add to the chat as we're going along here. So Benjamin Perez asks, are most aviators Renaissance men and women like you, or most brawn is greater than brains like Slider? 50-50 split. Is there an archetype? And I was kidding in my response some time ago. I said, did you just call me a geek slash nerd? But I get what Benjamin is asking. It's a great question. So I think I was able to capture this in my debut novel, Punk's War. And that's the reason I actually started writing that book, as I was reading techno thrillers and other sort of books that sort of worship the airplanes and didn't really go deep on the people involved. So the answer, Benjamin, is it's both. I don't know if it's a 50-50 split, but you have Renaissance men and you have some guys and girls now who at a glance look like the brawn types, the all-American boys and girls. But then when you engage them, you realize that they're deeper and more intellectually rounded than maybe you might give them credit for. Obviously, flying an airplane like the Tomcat, and not to mention the current airplanes we have, F-35, Super Hornets, requires mental acuity. You have to be able to process information quickly, make decisions unflinchingly, keep your head in high stress environments. So that requires a certain amount of brains. But it's also a physical undertaking. Pulling G's is a very physical thing. You have to be in great shape, particularly core and arm strength. And even with an airplane that is, let's just say, easier to fly than the Tomcat, like the F-35, your body is put under great strain. In fact, the G limit on the Super Hornet and the F-35 is greater than that the Tomcat was, NATOP's limit of the Tomcat was 6.5. Today they're doing 8, 9 Gs as a matter of course every sortie. So that takes brawn. And we did endeavor to work out, especially on cruise. You'd make time to work out on a daily basis. So now the Renaissance part is the part that's the X factor, let's just say, whereas yes, these people are smart, but are they well read? Are they patrons of the arts? Do they know how to play an instrument? Do they have some hobby like horticulture or something else where they're really literate and it's a passion for them? That's another thing that in your average ready room, people weren't inclined to reveal this, certainly not when you're new, because it might generate a call sign. For instance, there was a guy who knew how to play the tuba. And so when that was discovered, when he was a new guy, that became his call sign, tuba. And he was actually a music major. I forget what college he went to, but that was pretty rare that a music major became a fighter pilot. But you don't want to show too much of yourself before people know who you are professionally. And so people would be guarded about maybe some of their esoteric hobbies or whatever. But in time, there's not a whole lot you can hide when you're deployed for 180 days and living basically on the O3 level of an aircraft carrier for weeks on end. So, and that was part of the fun of being in a fighter squadron. So I think the bottom line, Benjamin, is it's all of that. There's not really an archetype, and I think people who would suggest there is, with this sort of hagiography, this hero worship, are mistaken. And I think that's the good news: is these are real people who have an exceptional talent, but they're not all one size fits all. And then Benjamin, you say the society that separates its scholars from its warriors. Okay, but for my money, I like warriors that are scholars, you know. That's Marcus Aurelius, right? All right. So hello from Pakistan. Hello, Umar. Great to see you. Neuropilot. Wouldn't that be the UCAV operator do a video conference into the squadron briefing room? I'm not sure what that question's about. So here's my good friend and patron, Antonio, coming in from Mexico. He's actually was in the Mexican Air Force. Great fellow. So Antonio says, hi, Mooch. How my RIO experiences influence the way I fly the F-14 in DCS. Do I have an inside baseball angle to the front seat? Yes, absolutely. So the reason I was able to sort of jumpstart my DCS flying, and I've been doing it for about 8 months now. It took me some time to get the rig put together. I was waiting on some sponsorships from Thrustmaster and Eagle Dynamics, and then it takes a while to get up to speed. That's the beauty of DCS. It's super realistic. It's not quite just a plug and play kind of thing. So certainly my ability, particularly to fly the Tomcat in terms of the front seat, was jump-started by the fact that I was a RAG instructor. And as a RAG instructor, that's the F-14 training squadron, I was an instructor in VF-101, the Grim Reapers. That squadron's been disestablished. It had a brief resurrection as the F-35 RAG some years ago, and then it was killed again, which broke my heart. Cool logo, skeleton holding a sickle with cool goggles on, and flying along. It's a classic. It's has a World War II pedigree. The Flatley and those guys in World War II were the Grim Reapers. So that during those years when I was an instructor, I would spend a lot of time in the front seat simulator for the Tomcat, which the nomenclature for the front seat simulator was the 2F95. So I'd spend a lot of time in the 2F95 because what you realized at the wrong moments is with a Cat 1 pilot who's fresh from getting his wings, as much or more about the front seat than he or she does. And so I took pride in being able to literally fly the airplane from the back seat. The other thing that allowed me to be a good stick and rudder kind of guy was during my time as the editor of Approach Magazine, and I've relayed this in one of my interviews on Aircrew Interview. If you haven't seen those, check it out. But when I was the editor of Approach Magazine, which is the Naval Aviation Safety magazine, I was allowed, and I was the first editor that was allowed to do this, to fly over at the Naval Air Station Oceana, which was about 25 miles away from the Naval Safety Center on base at Naval Air Station Norfolk. If you're familiar with Hampton Roads, the laydown of the bases there. Very military dense environment, a great area. I love Virginia Beach and Hampton Roads. So I would go over and fly with this aggressor squadron, VF-43, as much as they could. And the schedule writer was another Tomcat RIO who would hook me up a lot. And so we'd fly F-16Ns, which is the TF-16N, two-seat version of the Viper with the F-110 engine, the GE engine, same engine as in the F-14 B and D. That thing is an absolute spank machine, cool airplane. So I got to fly that a number of times. F-5F, back to the F-5F, and TA-4, the training version of the A4. They had the J model, and they also had a J model with a P8, which is a bigger engine, and they called that the Super Swine. So that was a real cool airplane. So I got to fly those airplanes a lot. And that involved getting a lot of stick time. So I learned how to fight those airplanes. I learned how to take off and land those airplanes. And I learned how to fly really tight form. And so the pilots like to give the airplane to the backseater, if it was somebody who's experienced, and see how long that you could not scare them or goon up the fight or whatever. So I got pretty good at all of those regimes flying, and that made me very much appreciate, being smooth with the controls, what power did. I also flew with the Reserve Squadron VFC-12 a number of times. I do cross countries whenever one of the pilots there needed to go somewhere or whatever. I was always up for that. And then I had a lot of backseat time in the Tomcat squadrons, just to keep my hand in being a RIO as well. So those were good years. That was 2 years of doing that. So that, Antonio, very much informs my ability to fly not just the Tomcat module, because I'm also flying the Hornet and the P-51, and also my good friend Casmo. You guys may know Casmo TV. That channel is awesome. He was a Kiowa Apache driver. He's taught me how to fly the Apache, which is really amazing. I do have some stick time in Navy helicopters. So yeah, the bottom line is that does very much inform my ability to fly DCS. And I'm also doing some backseat stuff. So everybody's like, why don't you do the backseat too? I am. I just haven't recorded that yet. And so we're going to do an episode where I do my best techniques for RIOs too. So Fogsy23 says, hi, Mooch. I've been getting this growing itch to become a test pilot after undergrad, but I'm nearsighted. I've talked to some test pilots already, and the suggestion is to speak to a flight surgeon. Okay, so part A, to go to test pilot school, and to be clear, there are 3 official and what's the word I'm looking for? Sanctioned test pilot schools in the world. Empire Test Pilot School, they're in the UK. Navy Test Pilot School at Patuxent River Naval Air Station, and Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base. So those are all hard to get into. There are different categories where you can go to test pilot school. You can go as a civilian. There are civilians in each test pilot class. Usually they're engineers who work for a government agency. I think they have had some corporate types, defense firm interns, as it were, go through the test pilot school program. And then there are aviators from all services: Army, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Navy. Now, let me speak to the Navy piece. So I have astigmatism, and I've had it since I was a junior at the Naval Academy. So, but my vision is correctable to 20/20, or at least it used to be. I'm not sure it is anymore. So as long as your vision is correctable to 20/20, you can get into flight school. And these days, with LASIKs and all the other corrective surgery you can get, you can probably get corrected to 20/20. And so now you're eligible to go to flight school. So once you're at flight school and you get your wings, now you do your first sea tour, and then you apply to test pilot school. It's competitive. So you have to have good fitness reports, kind of a good track record. And then the other thing about test pilot school is it's really hard. It's 10 months of very intense engineering, and you fly a sortie, and then you write a 40-page test plan on that sortie. It teaches you how to test aircraft. And what happens to the Navy folks after they finish test pilot school is they go to a test squadron like VX-23 at Patuxent River that does the developmental and operational test of whatever airplane it is that they're working on. So in the case of VX-23, they're doing the developmental test of the Super Hornet and the F-35. And so that's a cool job. And so I don't know if that answers the question, but I do recommend, if you have the itch, you pursue it. So either after undergrad, get your master's in whatever engineering discipline you're doing. I don't know what your major is, and then go work for a government agency. Any one of them. Aviation related would be better. And then you can apply to test pilot school as a civilian, as a GS. But I think the more surefire way is to go to flight school, get your wings either as a pilot or a weapons system officer, NFO, and then apply after your squadron tour. And again, the asterisk on that course of action is you've got to be top of your ready room to get into test pilot school. P90s or humbuckers? Hammer asks. So behind me, I have both. right? So this is why I have 4 guitars and counting, because you don't want to pick, right? And so I'm in a cover band now, and so if we're playing, like say some Kinks or Smithereens, it's probably a P90. If we're playing The Who or Aerosmith, definitely humbuckers, right? So the beauty of that is you don't have to pick. They each have a distinct sound. I just got this Les Paul Jr. with the dog-eared P90 as a Christmas gift from the wife, and I love that guitar just as much as I love my Les Paul. And my newest acquisition is the Jackson Soloist, which is a really cool guitar. It has the Seymour Duncan pickups and the Floyd Rose whammy system and all that. It's a really cool guitar, very distinct uh, uh, sound. So we don't have to pick Hammer, right? They're both good. Then Foxy asks, what would I recommend as corrective surgery as a viable option? I don't know. Talk to your physician. Talk to somebody who's had it. I don't know. I never had that corrective surgery. My glasses, I wear progressives that keep getting thicker, right? In my advanced years here. So I don't know. If anybody has a recommendation, add it to the chat. Neuropod says, you mean like how General Jim Chaos Mattis was a warrior monk? Yeah, he's a good example. And I know a few other guys. Admiral Stavridis is let's call it poet warrior. General McChrystal, very much so. I think if you engage any 3 or 4 star, I bet you money that they have a bibliography that is far and wide. These are individuals who've delved into philosophy, the human condition, because of the responsibilities they undertake. They need to have, let's just call it the big picture. So yeah, General Mattis definitely is one of those who could draw on all kinds of stuff. Admiral Stockdale was amazing with respect to that sort of stuff. Umar asked, how important did you find GCI when you were flying? Is it that important now? So the Tomcat with the AUG-9, our radar was 65 degrees from either side of the nose. So that's a semi-soda straw kind of view, right? We can only see part of the sky. So GCI in the form of AWACS or E2 was essential, fundamental. You had to have it. Otherwise, you were going to get jumped, most likely. So, yeah, GCI, and including like the cruisers, the Aegis cruisers that we had in the shotgun roll Alpha Whiskey. My last deployment is USS Normandy. Those guys were super good, and that's a super capable system. So, a Tomcat without good GCI is half the equation, quite frankly. Good question. And it's okay. So now, I think you still need somebody, and current events proves this out. You still need somebody to tie it all together. So that's an AWACS or an E2D these days. F-35 has got this Intel Fusion that makes it, we call it a mini AWACS. These guys have situational awareness that is eye-watering, but still the ability to process that and contextualize that in a time-sensitive fashion is the trick. And that's what the God's eye view of AEW, like AWACS and the E2, give you. They will jump into the clutter and say, your vector is, and weapon status is. And so it's just like, oh, okay, suddenly I just do what I'm told, and I'm not trying to process it or make decisions at my level. And that, in the heat of battle, is a real relief, actually. And that's how you're going to get, in a multi-bandit, high-threat environment, that's how you're going to get kills. But another good question there. Let's see what else we got here. John Minter asked, what squadrons did you fly with while you were in a Tomcat RIO? Did you do any live intercepts of Soviet aircraft? Wildstone Cruise. Again, we cover this in the episode I did with Mike on the channel. But the quick answer is, and I'll go in order. I was in VF-32. We cruised aboard the USS Independence and the USS John F. Kennedy, the old Kennedy, not the Ford-class carrier that's being built. Then I did a Super JO cruise, or Super JO tour in VF-143, the Puking Dogs. That's the picture that was the thumbnail for this Q&A. That's the era I was in the Puking Dogs. Aboard the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, my first nuke boat. That was an all-star team. Then I was assigned to be a Tomcat instructor in VF 101, the RAG. And so I flew out of Oceana. We would det to Key West for tactics and El Centro for strike. And also we'd go to Fallon for strike. Just what a great tour that was. And again, that was an all-star team. That's the best from every squadron on the East Coast. And we also had some Hornet guys that were cross-pollinating to do the strike mission, because bombing was pretty new to the Tomcat in those years. This was the early to mid 90s. So from there, I went to, I was yanked out of that to go be aide to Air Land, 3-star Admiral Tony Less, a great legendary naval officer. And that was a gift. And then from there, I went to VF 102, the Diamondbacks, now a Super Hornet F-18F squadron on Reagan. But in those days, we were aboard the USS America, the last cruise of CV-66. We did the Bosnian conflict, spent most of our time in the Adriatic, flying a lot. We broke all existing records for sorties and flight hours that year, which is basically 1995-96. And the record-breaking year was 96. The squadron won the Battle E, the Clifton, and the Safety S, just a sweep. So that was, and all of these squadrons except for VF-32 were B squadrons. That was the other thing that I was very lucky. I got to fly the more advanced Tomcat with the better engine. You know, as you guys probably know, the F-14A had the Pratt & Whitney TF-30, which was originally designed for the F-111, was not optimized for the Tomcat, and therefore had a tendency to compressor stall, just like in the movie Top Gun. And you know, I had probably a handful in the time that I was flying in that tour. So it really was an issue. We didn't do any flat spins, didn't lose any airplanes, but during those years we lost a lot of Tomcats to flat spins, and so that's a real thing. But from that point forward, I got to be in the Tomcat with the GE motor, so that was a lot better. So that continued in VF 102, F-14Bs on the oldest carrier that the Navy had pretty much at that time. It's now a reef at the bottom of the Atlantic, unfortunately, but she was working great when we were aboard. And then from there, I stayed in the same air wing and became the air wing operations officer. And I flew with VF 102, and we cross-decked from America to George Washington, which is still in the fleet to this day. So that's the Tomcat squadrons that I was in. Let me make sure I got the full question. And then the last part of John's question was, did I ever do any live intercepts of Soviet aircraft? Yes. Particularly, I intercepted an AN-22 coming out of Karachi, headed to Djibouti. So we were able to intercept. That was a perfect Tomcat scenario. Blue water, gorgeous day. I got the contact at about 120 miles and did a nice gentle rendezvous, and then escorted that airplane all the way past the Independence. You want to make sure that the Tomcat is in the field of view, so that any pictures they take from that AN-22 have a Tomcat in them, just as a gentle reminder that, if you do anything provocative, it could go poorly for you. And then our squadron mates, I never had a chance to intercept a bear or a badger, but they did on other events, particularly when we were in the North Atlantic on Eisenhower. They came out to take a look at what we were doing. So that was the bread and butter, what the Tomcat did in those days. Not so much a mission necessarily, although there are intercepts happening in the Western Pacific with the Chinese these days, quite a bit. Was the Tomcat ever considered for carrying harm? Uh, yes, but it came down to priorities and budget. So the harm money, like the Phoenix money, was zeroed out so that we could get the Lantern Pod system on the Tomcat. And Snort Snodgrass, the late great Snort Snodgrass, may he rest in peace, made that decision, and it proved to be the right one going forward, particularly the post 9/11 conflicts up to 2006, where the Tomcat was disestablished. But Lantern changed everything for precision weapons and how the F-14 was used. Um, would you have liked the F-14 to have lasted long enough to receive AMRAAM? Um, yeah, in fact, they were going to put AMRAAM on the Tomcat. Again, it fell into the same matrix as the air war was sort of moribund, atrophying, going into 9/11. We were seeing that the Tomcat, because the A6 went away and the F-18 had very short legs, we're going to have to get the Tomcat to pick up the slack, except a supersonic version of what the Intruder was capable of doing. Obviously, the Intruder was a bomb truck. It could carry 24 Mark 80 series bombs. The Tomcat could carry 6 at the most, and generally we'd carry 4. But you could put precision guided munitions on the airplane with the Lantern Pod, and so that was great. The Freckle Puny, that was the reason we didn't get AMRAAM. It was a budgetary decision. It would have worked great on the F-14 had we been able to get it, and it would have given us the stick length to compete with the Hornet, because that's what they had on us. So we'd shoot Phoenix, they'd notch or just go into turn around. Phoenix would go stupid, and then they'd come back in. And now we're in the medium part of the BVR timeline, and we'd have to sort of dive into the notch to try to defeat the AMRAAM. Generally, we didn't. And then when we come out of the notch, we're trying to get a lock so that we can employ Sparrow as the medium range weapon. And we have to have a lock to do that. It wasn't in an autonomous missile. And meanwhile, they've already shot the AMRAAM. So what we found is we were continually getting outgunned by Hornets with AMRAAM in general, unless they were caught unawares with our long-range Phoenix shot, which generally they weren't. So I thought, Neuropilot says, I thought in the F-18, once the engine started and carefully onto the runway, a test dummy could be up front. Yeah, well, that's not quite true. I like to joke that I wouldn't fly a Super Hornet or an F-35 because I wouldn't fly an airplane that doesn't have a front seat. But basically, the way pilots stand that logic on its head and say, okay, now because of technology and HOTAS and everything else, everything that you used to do as a RIO, I can do myself. Now, that's true to a degree. Some high task environments like close air support, forward air control, or airborne, when the missiles start flying, you're going to want guys looking different directions to avoid getting shot down. So, WISOs are doing great work these days, but I've heard from some Tomcat guys that transitioned to the Super Hornet, and they're like, quite frankly, the level of redundancy in the Super Hornet makes the RIO, the WISO, semi-redundant to the degree that the Tomcat RIO was not. What the RIO did with the AUG-9 was paint a picture using his displays that the pilot did not have, and controls of the radar that the pilot did not have. And that made that relationship very unique and special. It was absolutely teamwork. And I'm not suggesting that pilots and WISOs don't have great teamwork now. I'm just saying it was different and less redundant, So Fogsy says, I'm currently a double major in mech and aero. Okay, perfect. Those are perfect majors for your goals. What's something you would have liked to do in your Navy career but never got the chance? Volky and Deji asks that. Great question. So for me, the Navy was very good to me. I did nothing but fly, and my shore duty jobs were, working on my artistic side, my writing side. And so I think what I wish I had been able to do was command a fighter squadron. That's a competitive thing, and It just didn't fall my way when it came time to get screened for command. I have no bitterness or resentment for that, because I know the guys who did screen instead of me, and they had better records than I did. And part of the asterisk on that lives in Punk's War. If you read Punk's War, that's kind of me doing the cathartic thing of writing about some of the COs that I worked for and didn't get along with. But that's again, that's a very specific circumstance. And after that, the Navy did nothing but accommodate who I was as an individual and allow me to thrive professionally. Again, look at as I've already described to a previous question, I was in basically 5 different fighter squadrons, and stationed at NAS Oceana and on the carriers and whatnot. So as I look at it with the wisdom of hindsight, I can't believe I was able to do that. And obviously my channel basic theme is that. And so now I'm able to reawaken all of those eras and people. And in many cases, I've had my old friends, old squadron mates like Scott Kelly, Reb Edwards, and guys like that on the channel to talk about, our days of being these fighter guys. It's a great life. I just spoke to some NROTC midshipmen at Catholic University on Friday, and I guess it was on Thursday, and that was my pitch to them. You're going to live a life of the greatest consequence, and this is true for any nation's military. And so that's really something you should appreciate and double down on once you get the opportunity. So, yeah, I guess if I had a regret, it was that, or one thing I wish I could have. I wish I could have commanded a fighter squadron. What's the gouge on being a good RIO and DCS? Well, do your study, and there are a number of YouTube episodes. There's one that's like over 2 hours long by CAG 11 is the channel, CVW 11. And that guy, I mean, that should be part of or I wish we'd had that in the RAG back when we were learning the backseat. So you've got to know the switchology and all the buttons and all the stuff. Then you got to know your modes and where and what flight regime to use them. So I do owe the DCS community Mooch's take on the practical application of the theory of the AUG-9. And so I'm going to do that. I'll probably be flying with Tricker. If you guys know Tricker, he's been my flight instructor more or less for DCS. And I have flown in his backseat before. So that's probably the one we'll record. So Combat Aviation says, hi, Mooch, great work. Will you have Reed Wiseman, former F-14 pilot and current NASA astronaut, commander of Artemis II, on your show at some point? Yes, absolutely. And I do have a conduit to get to Reed. And so, yeah, stay tuned for that. And you also, then you say that we did talk about, when I was talking to Scott Kelly, the astronaut, that incident where I put my foot on the skipper's helmet. So check that episode out. That shows you some of what can happen in the squadron. It's funny now. Maybe it wasn't necessarily funny at the time, although we did laugh about it once we got down in the ready room. So Captain Icelander, are you in Iceland? I've been there. It's great. I went to Keflavik. He says, hi, Ward. Thanks for your awesome channel. You think you're going to do some more DCS content in the future? Yeah, absolutely. I love DCS. I'm flying it all the time. We just did the episode with Nasty that just got made public yesterday. Yes, for sure. I'll do Strike, Lantern. We'll do some of the major campaign stuff. I've done Paco's Speed and Angels campaign, which I highly recommend. If you're flying the Tomcat module, you have to do Speed and Angels. It's like going through the RAG. That's fantastic. So yes, there'll be more DCS episodes to follow. Thanks for the question. Trey Aldridge asks, if you can make any one dedicated Air Force plane into a carrier-based plane, which would you choose? That's a great Well, so let's just say that the F-35 is already that, right? So that's an Air Force plane that's a carrier-based plane. But I think your question is one that never was. So let me just say probably the Strike Eagle, because that airplane is so capable in terms of the strike fighter and what the Wizzo is able to do uh, with the MFDs and the targeting pods and the different controls in that airplane is sort of like what the Tomcat upgrade became with Lantern, but it was designed from inception to do that. Easier to maintain, more modular in terms of a digital architecture. Remember, the Tomcat was designed as an analog airplane that was over the years morphed into a digital airplane. So that was not the way you wanted to do it in terms of clean sheet design. So I think the quick answer I would give you is the Strike Eagle. Some people may say A10, but the problem with the A10 is just so darn slow. And if you've watched my episode with Casey Campbell, that thing tops out at about 250 knots, and we're going to be pretty far away from the objective, whereas the Air Force is closer. So if you look at any of the campaigns that they've ever done, they're a couple hundred miles at the most away from the objective. We're 800 miles away at times. Desert Storm particularly, some of those carriers in the Red Sea had to transit 800 miles to get to the target, which is okay, right? And so you need an airplane that's faster, is my point. And so again, I think my answer would be the Strike Eagle. Scariest moment when flying. So I've had a number. One was a near midair with a F-15C, an Air Force F-15C over Morocco. We came too close to hitting an F-15 that was parked in front of us. My pilot didn't realize he was tail sliding, and he was pressing a Sidewinder solution, and that airplane it was literally this close. He thumped us. So that comes to mind. The other is one I've recounted a couple of times, North Atlantic. Hoser Miller, who you guys may know from the Raven One series and his books, including the Silver Waterfall, which is his fictionalized version of the Battle of Midway. Fantastic. But Hoser was CAG Paddles, Air Wing LSO, when I was in VF 143, and we're up there in super rough seas. Iceland, UK Gap, Shetland Islands, green water over the bow, trying to come back aboard after doing a strike in Scotland, which was a lot of fun. But landing back aboard was not fun. And so that was scary, just put it that way. We did manage to get aboard on the fourth pass, really tight on gas. And the other thing about that is the water was very cold. So if we'd had to eject because we flamed out, we probably weren't going to survive the hypothermia that was going to happen. So those come into mind. There's another, there's a bunch of other sort of near misses and nights in the barrel, and what were you thinkings over the years? But that's part of the fun, right? That's why we do it. I'm not allowed to say Need for Speed TR-301 because I'll be fined for using a Top Gun line. Butch, another former RIO from the West Coast, VF21124 says, hello, Butch. Yeah, good squadrons. Was Bio the skipper when you were or Ollie? Ollie's a good friend of mine. On Nimitz. What do I think about the Navy using Super Hornets as pseudo? So this is Mike L asking, or is it Mike I? What do I think about the Navy using Super Hornets as pseudo tankers as a stopgap? It seems like it's putting unneeded hours on the airframes. And the answer is that's a terrible idea. And you are correct. That has absolutely trashed the life expectancy of the Super Hornet. And they were used a lot during the post 9/11 campaigns to be the organic tankers, and in some cases the mission tankers, until they were able to pick up what the heavy tankers were, where the heavy tankers were on the other tracks. So we need to get away from that, which is why that the MQ-25 was assigned the tanker role, was to get back to the organic tanking. We had dedicated tankers back in the day. The Intruder had a tanker variant that was used only for that. And that was, I think each squadron had 2 of the tanker variants. And then we would slap buddy stores on A7s in those days. Those guys hated that mission as well. But I think it's a bad idea. And the way forward demonstrates that it is a bad idea. Let me get a sip of liquid here for a second. And we'll pick it up with Matt's question. So Mike Aiken says, I remember when Denkler was Command of America when it was sunk. Yeah, I know Denk very well, Tomcat Rio. So Matt also says, hey, Mooch, I remember supporting you in Kosovo from Sigonella. We got a phone call to just come in for God knows how long to support a mission. Good memories, keeping all the gear up and watching. So if you're talking about 95 Kosovo, I wasn't, or what year was that? 98 Kosovo? So I was doing Bosnia, and we broke the siege of Sarajevo in 95, 96. So I don't know if that's the same era that you're talking about, Matthew. Now, if you've watched some of the episodes with Slapshot, Admiral Carter, he was skipper of F-14 in Kosovo, so you definitely supported him. So I'm sure he would thank you for that effort. Neuropod says, I heard the flat spin scene in Top Gun was probably the most realistic scene in the movie. No, absolutely not. And mostly because of the line that says, he's in a flat spin and headed out to sea, which flat spin is like this. It's not like a Frisbee, right? So you're not headed anywhere except down when you're in a flat spin. Now, they used the premise of how you would enter a flat spin and fictionalized it as accurate as Tony Scott could manage, right? So compressor stall caused by jet wash, that's possible, and snuffs one of the engines and generates a high yaw rate in a hurry that Maverick cannot control. All possible. So I don't know if that's the most realistic scene, but it's got some accurate elements to it. But like the rest of the movie, it's mostly fiction. But who am I? As Tony Scott, may he rest in peace, said, I don't make movies for fighter guys. I make movies for moviegoers. And, you know, he's done pretty well with that particular film. Would the most modern F-14D still be relevant in a BVR fight against today's 4th gens? Yes, because that radar, and what was the APG, I'm blanking on 25? It was a digital radar. So it was years ahead of its time. So the D would still be relevant. The B had the AUG-9. So no, it would not be. And it wasn't towards the end of its life, except for the fact that we put Lantern on the airplane. Pukin George says, hi, Mooch. A Phoenix question. In DCS, it seems very easy to notch, ditch the AIM 51. I think you mean AIM 54. Was that done in your career? So are you talking about cut it to active? Is that what you mean? So once it goes active, it doesn't need to be supported. So if you watch the missile time of flight counter and it reaches 10, you can assume that missile is active. So now it doesn't need your radar support. So I think, and I know that Heat Blur used kind of, not that it's classified, but they used accurate information to come up with how that behaves. And what I've seen firing 50 plus mile Phoenixes is the missile time of flight and APOL look to be about right to me, and so we definitely notch. And you didn't want to dump the Phoenix in the process, of course, if you didn't have to, but you also have to honor the forward quarter threat, particularly of Su-27s and MiG-29s, right? Once we got into the more capable forward quarter active missiles that the Russians got. In the early days, it was all 3-9 line stuff and ATOLs and guns, so that wasn't a factor. But once they got better, we had to honor that threat as well as support our missile in flight. Again, that speaks to why AMRAAM is such a better medium range weapon than Sparrow was. Which of the F-8? Okay, so I want to make sure I don't jump ahead. So that's a good question, Puke and George. Freckle Puny asks, which of the naval or land-based type would you wish to have flown once or twice, current and historic? Wow, that's a great question. So just like Maverick, I love the P-51. If I could own my own airplane, I would, look to buy a P-51 because there's a lot around, so it's maintenance friendly compared to the other warbirds. I'd love to fly a Corsair, the F-4U, because it's such a legendary airplane, allowing that it's really challenging to taxi and land, particularly on the ship. I would love to fly the Phantom. That was my first airplane in the backseat. I flew an F-4J, a Marine Corps F-4J. That's a cool airplane. And I'd like to fly the Joint Strike Fighter. I quite frankly think I could fly it. I mean, I'd need some training, of course, but that's such a capable airplane. I would like to a greater degree, understand what an F-35 pilot has at his disposal. So that's what I'd like to fly. So that's a quick answer to the current and future. John Minter asks, which of the E or F models is the preferred option for the pure air-to-air missions in today's Navy? I think that's a push. Now, the question is, where is the F? What are the missions where you would want an F? And what I'm hearing is that's close air support, because somebody's got to write down the 9 line and pay attention to the moving parts of CAS and FAC-A, Forward Air Controller Airborne. That's definitely a 2-seat mission. And then the other is dense environments where you need another set of eyeballs. Obviously, you're not going to hate having a Wizzo in the airplane. But otherwise, I think strict air-to-air missions, I think E or F is good for those missions. What I think of so Freckle Puny again asks, what do I think of the Chinese Navy's plans with their carrier program? And do I think they could ever catch up to the Navy capability-wise? So it's concerning, right? This is why the Department of Defense is paying attention. The Fujian has emails. It's a conventionally powered carrier, as I've documented in a couple of episodes, but it has emails. They're able to build them in about a fifth of the time it's currently taking us to build a Ford-class carrier. So that's just numbers game if you consider a high-end fight with hypersonics and patrol craft and destroyers and cruisers and everything else. On paper, the Chinese Navy is bigger than the U.S. Navy. So if you're adding to that more and more carriers with airplanes, now their sortie generation rate is a small percentage of ours. Basically, when they're doing 25, we're doing 100 or more. So that's leveraging a century, 50 years of a century of flight and 50 years of aircraft carriers, right? I think, no, it's more than 50 years. What am I saying? It's 100 years of aircraft carriers. That's what I meant to say. Yeah. And so they're playing catch up. If you even just executing the mobility TAC note, case one launch, case one recovery. If you look at that ballet and the way that you can launch, let's say nominally 30 airplanes and then recover 30 airplanes, and that takes you about 25 minutes to recover 30 airplanes, good luck, China, in executing that kind of thing. Further, a ski jump is a different ballgame than having conventional carrier catapults like emails like Fujian's going to have. But they only have 2. We have 4. So I'm not concerned. So I think the short answer is I don't think they'll ever catch up to us capability-wise. Now, does that mean we would win the war? I think the latest Center for Naval Analysis war game that was run a couple dozen times, the way that netted out was the United States Navy won, but we lost 2 carriers in the process. So that's pretty heavy losses since we only have 9 carriers, period. So you can sort of start to think, okay, if you add a longer war with attrition, numbers do matter, right? As Admiral Paparo says, numbers are a capability unto themselves. And so we have to honor the fact that they're able to make perhaps lesser capability platforms, but more of them faster. So again, a long answer, I apologize, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. So Obert Stroopy says, hey, Ward, so cool to catch you live on air. I'm a big F-14 fan. Greetings from Austria. Hello. How are things there? How was ski season this year? Is it still going on? I've never skied Austria. I've skied Switzerland. MKMD Exploration and Paranormal says, hi, Ward, what's your thoughts on the F-14, on the F-4 being released soon on a DCS? I'm going to download it and fly it. Yes, I think that's really cool and good for whoever's. Do we know what is that Eagle Dynamics or who's designing that one? That's overdue, and I'm glad it's coming out. Flew one of the swept wing aircraft in the F-14. What's my opinion on the other swept wing plane, the F-111? F-111 was a super capable airplane for the low-level strike mission. It was designed, those guys sat side by side in a capsule. So when they ejected, the capsule came off. TF-30, that's the engine that was designed for that airplane. So it worked great in the F-111. In fact, at mill power, they were a scream machine. We could not keep up. We'd have to tap burner in the A to keep up with the F-111 at mill power with the same engines. So, like Dorado Canyon or El Dorado Canyon and some other ops proved, it's a super capable airplane. And the sweep wings worked great, right? Was it necessary? That wasn't quite a dogfighting airplane, but it did give it good low speed handling characteristics, and then it could fly really fast. Technology has proved that swept wing is unnecessary, just like multiple geometry, variable geometry inlets. You don't need those if you design the inlet correctly. But in its day, and I'm proud to have flown a swept wing fighter when I was able to. Hi, Mooch. Do you know Okie Nance, and do you think you could get him on the channel? So, Christian, go look at my video homepage, and there's one called The Sultan of Spank. And that's an interview with my good friend Okie Nance, who was one of my original RAG instructors. And then he was CO of the Aggressor Squadron some years after that. And so, yeah, I know Okie super well. And he has been on the channel already. So check out that episode. If I had a producer, I'd have he or she cut and paste the link and drop it into the chat here. Maybe I can do that as I'm talking here. Hold on. Stand by. I'm going to try to find the Okie episode just while we're sitting here. I did this one a while ago. Here we are. Okay. All right. I'll drop this into the chat. All right. Did I carry a sidearm? This is Trevor's question. Trevor Aaron, did I carry a sidearm? Yes. If so, what? Well, so early, let me make sure I get this right. So we carried sidearms during Operation Southern Watch, and we carried sidearms during the Bosnian conflict. So early in my career, they were Beretta 9mm. And then later, when I was CAG Ops, they were Sig Sauers. And so we'd get issued the sidearm and 2 magazines to go flying. Yeah, that was never. And there was always what are you going to do if you eject? Are you going to shoot your way out? Or are you just going to like drop the weapon and raise your hands? A lot of different opinions on how practical having a small arm was. Maybe killing animals while you were evading to survive would be a good use of the weapon, although it would make noise and that might give away your position. So a lot of different discussions about it, but we were trained in the use of both the Beretta 9mm and the Sig Sauer. So David, I'd love to see Oki on the channel. Check out the link that I just posted, and you will see Oki on the channel. Oberst asked, what about the F-14B flaps? Yeah, I know you go to full flaps, and that was against NATOPS. So yes, if you can get them down and then back up without inducing a flap slat lockout, then have at it. In real life, if you did that, you'd definitely get grounded, if not lose your wings, because that's violating NATOPS. So this is something that the legend of Snort Snodgrass, he would drop the big boys occasionally as a way to beat his opponent. So it's a good trick if you have to win and you don't care about having a flap light. But just understand that if you had a flap light in the real airplane, you couldn't get the flaps raised again. So there you go.
Right, Ward, I'm going to ask you to maybe answer one or two more questions to wrap up this brilliant Q&A.
Okay. Wow, time goes fast, huh?
It does.
So Ender asked, do you think the F-14 should have been a tanker as well? No. I'm glad I never had to do that mission. Let's make sure the last one is I'll just scan here a little bit. Okay, here's a good, and I get asked this a lot. So Joe asks, I'm curious about the training path for aircrew. Are RIOs trained as pilots up to a certain point, then the two roles diverge? No. RIOs were trained as RIOs, just like WIZOs are trained as WIZOs. And then really the roles converge once you get in the airplane. So as I described early on, I was able to learn about the front seat because it behooves a RIO, just like it behooves a weapons system officer, to understand the front seat in the event things go south or the pilot is having trouble with something in terms of emergency procedures or whatever. You're of much more utility if you wear your co-pilot hat, deeply. And I took great pride in being a good co-pilot as well as a good weapons system operator. So they don't diverge, they converge. And RIOs were never trained as pilots. We learned a lot of pilot stuff along the way, just like pilots were never trained as RIOs, but it was to their advantage to understand the backseat, radar modes, all that sort of stuff. So they could manage the intercept if they didn't think it was going the way they thought it should, right? So that was the beauty of the F-14. You got to know both cockpits as well as you can. Great question.
Right, I'm going to jump in and I've got one question for you here, Ward. What did you think about the Tornado F3?
Say the Tornado F3?
Yeah.
So I've done a number of ops, basically in the 6th Fleet area of responsibility against tornadoes. Highly capable, low-level bomber. Kind of a grape, as we say, as Nasty says on the latest episode, as a fighter. So we could beat them in a dogfight. I escorted them on low-level missions and was always impressed with how low they got and how accurate their nav was and how they always hit the simulated target on time. I've had John Nickel on the channel to talk about his experience at Desert Storm and so forth. I know he has another book coming out. I'll have him on the channel again probably in late May or June. So a lot of what I know about the Tornado is through John. But I think it was an airplane built for a specific purpose, which is the beauty of having a land-based aircraft, unlike a carrier-based aircraft, where the first thing you do is build it so it can land on a carrier, and then you figure out what you want it to do. The Tornado was built for a specific mission, and it did that mission very well. So I'm a fan.
Absolutely. Ward, thank you very much for coming on this show. I mean, what a great Q&A this has been. And thank you very much to all the people who put the questions in. But yeah, Ward, where can we find you online just to wrap up this Q&A?
Okay, so obviously my main headquarters and where I can be found most times and with the widest reach is YouTube. Ward Carroll, 2 R's and 2 L's in Carroll. I do have a Twitter page that I've done for since '09. I've had a Twitter page where I do departures and my opinion on things going on domestically and internationally. I try not to get too political there, but sometimes I can't help myself. So follow me on Twitter. I have an Instagram page, and I also have a Twitch channel called The Real Mooch. And so those are the places you can find me. And if you check out any of my episodes, you can find where to get my channel merch and buy my first 3 novels, the Punk Trilogy, which I think if you enjoy any of my stories, you will love the Punks Trilogy. And if you want to know more about the F-14, there's a lot, including what's it like to be on a Tomcat squadron in those 3 novels. So again, they come in all formats. Check any of my episodes for the links on where to get that.
Absolutely brilliant. And everything will be linked in the description below. But Ward, thank you very much for coming on this Q&A. It's been absolutely brilliant. And thank you for everyone who joined us and putting the questions on the side. So Mooch, thank you very much. And yeah, have a great day.
Okay, Mike, always a pleasure. I look forward to talking to you again as soon as we can.
Cheers.